Welcome to the Integrated Solutions for Adaptive Verification demonstrator. The presented solutions have been developed during iDev 4.0 project within task 2.4.2 by Infineon Romania. Let us start with a few words on the adaptive verification concept. The adaptive verification can be defined as an iterative process where the information from its previous steps is used for the next verification step in order to optimally achieve the verification goal. As for our approach for adaptive verification, it starts with the configuration part where the involved variables and their associated ranges are defined, along with the algorithm objectives and the hyperparameters. The adaptive algorithm, under the form of an experiment controller, uses the information from the previous step to control the test bench and collect the results. The test bench can be either a circuit simulator, a verification environment, or a lab experimental setup. Finally, the results consist in a tabular data representation that stores the involved system parameters and their associated response. Optionally, they can be also processed and represented as Matlab plots, scatter plots, figures of merit, etc. Further, we will present two use cases, one for post-silicone and another one for the lab verification, based on two developed experiment controllers. During the first experiment, we will present the usage of adaptive verification in lab testing in order to improve the coverage, more precisely to find the issues that otherwise we may miss or we would be needed to put more effort in discovering them using the traditional way. First, let's start with the motivation, more precisely with a very simple typical example when testing voltage regulators. The current limit represents a typical requirement for voltage regulators and can be defined as the measured output current for different input voltages and forced output voltages. Nevertheless, it should not exceed a certain level, the specification. The current limit test involves putting a voltage source to the output of the voltage regulator. Here in the image we have a scatter matrix. On the horizontal we have the input voltage and on the vertical axis we have the forced output voltage. 1 point means one test and the output current is coded by color. For this example, the limit was around 500 milliamperes, which means that everything that is with green and blue is safe. It isn't violating the specifications, while yellow and red is violating the specifications. This image comprises 1,500 tests and no issues were found. In order to better understand the previous scatter plot, we transform it into a 3D plot. The first two dimensions are the operating conditions varied before, input voltage and forced output voltage. And the third one, on the vertical, is the response, IQ max. Now, what happens next, since everything looks good and no issues were found? If you can sample more points in this region, you can observe that for some points the current output exceeds the limit, it goes up to 800 milliamperes. Since this violates the specs, it represents an important issue. If you are a test engineer, you may think like this: I thought I have sampled quite exhaustively space and I observed nothing. I run 1,000 more tests and here it comes, I observe a problem. Now the natural question raised by test engineer is, what is the required number of tests in order to be sure that I do not miss such problems? This is a very difficult question to be answered and work is done in this direction. In this presentation we will show how our algorithm, with a given budget of runs, like this one, can spend them better in this space such that it can capture the problems. This is what this solution is about. In order to better understand the solution, let us discuss about the test setup. In the middle we have the voltage regulator. The varied operating conditions are the battery voltage, the temperature, and this voltage source that is connected here at the output of the voltage regulator. Indeed, if you apply here a voltage, the output voltage measured here will be constant, equal to the forced output voltage for a certain time up to 2 milliseconds. The test is performed after 1 millisecond because the first millisecond is left for the stabilization of the circuit. As specified in the requirements, the output current is measured during this test also after 1 millisecond. Next, the voltage source is turned off and the circuit gets back to its normal regulated state, which is 3 volts here in this example. After we disconnect the voltage source, you can observe that the output current is in null state because it's like an open circuit. The operating conditions ranges which we have to perform the test are depicted here. Because this requirement load current should not exceed 550 milliamperes must be valid regardless the variation of these operating conditions within each range. On this slide, you can observe the laboratory setup of this use case. The first component is the Matlab controller, namely the software that controls all the other setup components. The load board, the resistive load, is denoted by 2. It represents a resistors board controlled with SPI to set a series of series or parallel resistors in order to obtain a value as close as possible to the load current required for the measurement. The second board, number 3, is the DUT, the design under test board having the chip to be tested embedded into it. Besides it, there can also be found some additional components such as the input or output capacitor, and it also helps us connect the required measuring instruments needed for the test. 4 sums up all the required measuring instruments needed for the test. The laboratory setup is not the subject of iDev 4.0 activities. It serves the project scope in integrating the adaptive algorithms developed within the project framework in order to be available for a broader spectrum of similar verification tests and problems. The adaptive verification algorithm for coverage improvement starts with a predefined uniform distribution of input parameter combinations represented as a metric X. Each column represents a VI, VQ, and T variables combinations, meaning input voltage, temperature, and forced output voltage, and measurements are performed for every instance. Based on the available parameters and the corresponding response of current limit, a Gaussian process model is created. If the stopping criterion is reached, the maximum measure IQ max will represent the verification output. If not, an uncertainty function is created using the Gaussian process model. This uncertainty will exhibit extreme values in areas with sudden changes for the GP model. The next measurement will be performed for the parameter combination that maximizes the uncertainty function. Lastly, the determined next point and the corresponding IQ max are added to the model and the process is repeated until the stopping criterion is reached. On this slide, on the left, we can see the actual Matlab algorithm that is used for the experiment. On the right side, we can see the configuration used to run the experiment as it was used in the lab setup. The variables are the temperature, the input voltage, and the forced output voltage, and the output is the load current. Let us compare the two tests performed. We will start with the classical approach, the full grid. Here we have a scatter matrix. On the horizontal we have the variables. The first three are the operating conditions, temperature, input voltage, and forced output voltage. And the last one is the load current, the response that we measure. On the vertical we have the very same variables, so that we have scatter plots of pairs of variables, 2 by 2. For example, here we have depicted how the input voltage was sampled against the temperature, and you can see that is full grid. Once again, the output current is coded by color, and the limit was set around 550 milliamperes, around here, which means whenever you see green and blue, it is respecting the spec, while when you see yellow and red, it is violating the spec. Within 1,500 runs, no issue was detected. However, a very careful eye from the testing engineers might ask why the output current is increasing with the value of the input voltage and then it starts decreasing. We would like to investigate this region more. And what we have done is to run 1,000 more runs, as you can see here. The region of interest is now denser. Indeed, What we have observed is that first the behavior is for a very, very narrow range of input voltage, and it does not happen everywhere but only here. But then, with the help of this image, we can observe that yellow and red points, meaning that the requirements are not satisfied, are in this corner of forced output voltage and temperature, because for higher temperatures we only see green points. We can conclude that this is a very, very ugly case where the spec is violated in a very narrow region here, first in VI and then in the sub-region of temperature versus forced output voltage. But in the end, with the help of classical approach, the issue was still found. But first, prior knowledge was used, since a very careful engineer triggered the action, and second, it took time, more precisely a second experiment planning. Moreover, insisting in a certain region, it means you have to add some Excel tables where you plan the experiments, so it requires hours of work to rerun the experiments. With the help of our adaptive experiment controller, namely the uncertainty controller, we performed the same test with only 900 runs. And here we were able to detect the issues. More important, this was achieved with no prior knowledge and no human intervention. So, just in one run, we were able to detect these issues. Details on how does this experiment controller work can be found in the documentation. But it is important to highlight that this opens now the view for interesting applications, because now we can let an experiment controller algorithm explore this space and look for stranger behaviors like the one from here. To conclude, the uncertainty controller employed for the lab characterization use case, namely the current limits test, was able to offer a better coverage than full grid experiments plan, with less tests needed, and provide a better characterization for multiple factor variations, thus offering a better understanding of circuit function. Our adaptive solution provides a better characterization for multiple factor variation. It is easy to be used and integrated in existing testing flows as shown before. The developed solution was designed to address a problem encountered by one of Infineon's product lines, and the method has become part of the standard verification within one Infineon's product line, and it is being applied also for other responses, meaning requirements. The second example will show how our adaptive algorithms based on machine learning can solve real problems, such as phase margin characterization for voltage regulators in simulation. First, let's start with the problem description. The phase margin is the parameters that tell us whether the voltage regulator is stable or not. In the second snapshot, it is illustrated what happens at the input of a voltage regulator, namely an impulse, a step function is applied. Then, at the output of the circuit, a very short oscillation is expected. After this pulse, an overshoot will occur, followed by an undershoot, and then it will stabilize, since this is actually the job of voltage regulator. The difficulty in characterizing this parameter is that the phase margin depends on 6 operating conditions as follows: the battery voltage, the adjusting voltage if the voltage regulator is working in tracking mode, the temperature, the output capacitor, its parasitic resistance, and the load current. The stability is usually reported in the datasheet based on the two main parameters, the load current and the parasitic resistance of the capacitor. The reporting is done using such type of pictures where the stability region is depicted as the one presented here. However, the rest of the parameters are usually reported at a typical value, and then the analysis is performed in a simplified way since you have to vary only two parameters. The problem arises when the customers are calling us telling, I'm not operating at your typical values for the capacitance or for the temperature. I am using other values. Can you indicate me the new stability region? In order to answer this question, the colleagues are going to the lab and start characterizing the voltage regulator stability region on the spot, based on the inputs our customer gave us for the other parameters. What we want to achieve with our approach is to determine the stability of the voltage regulator at any combination of operating conditions for all 6 parameters. The adaptive verification algorithm for worst-case analysis starts with a predefined uniform distribution of input parameters combinations represented as a matrix X. Each column represents a VI, iLoad, T, C-filter, and R, ESR variables combinations, meaning load current, input voltage, external capacitor, its parasitic resistance, and the temperature. And simulations are performed for every instance. Based on the available parameters and their corresponding response of current limit, a metamodel is created. This metamodel encapsulates the circuit behavior. If the stopping criterion is reached, the minimum phase margin will represent the verification output. If not, distribution probability is created using the model that associates high probability values for parameters combinations that are closer to the metamodel minimum value. The next phase margin will be computed based on the simulation of the parameter combination xnext drawn according to the probability density function. Lastly, the determined next point and the corresponding phase margin are added to the model, and the process is repeated until the stopping criterion is reached. Here you can observe the master test bench schematic, which represents a typical topology for testing a low dropout voltage regulator in simulation. Based on it, a netlist generator is used, along with additional automation to generate a text-based netlist that will represent the final version of the circuit to be simulated. It contains a DUT, device under test, the actual ADO, the stimuli applied to it, the external capacitor, its equivalent series resistance, and the load current. In order to connect the machine learning algorithm to the actual circuit simulation, a Linux-based automated verification tool is used. It is an Infineon's internal verification environment, and its development does not represent the subject of the iDev40 activities. It serves the project scope in integrating the adaptive algorithms developed within the project framework in order to be available for a broader spectrum of similar verification tests and problems. The automation flow must be started from a Linux terminal, resulting in the following graphical user interface, able to detect the simulation setup containing the netlist and other necessary files to run the experiment. Next, the Matlab-based adaptive verification algorithm must be configured using a configuration file. It specifies the parameters to be varied and their ranges. For the current use case, the load current, the input voltage, the output capacitor, its equivalent series resistance, and the ambient temperature are varied. The phase margin is extractive based on the output signal of the LDO. The objective of this investigation is to find the region in the parameter space where the worst case scenario happens, where the phase margin is minimum. The settings presented in this slide are given as a Perl script, which will then generate the necessary dependencies to start and complete the experiment. The next step is starting the experiment by using the graphical user interface of the automation flow. Finally, the obtained results are gathered in a CSV file, as well as a Matlab and PNG figures. The actual Matlab algorithm used for the experiment can be observed in the left picture. On the right side, we can see the configuration used to run the experiment as generated through the Perl script. All 5 operating conditions are considered: IQ, CQ, RESR, temperature, while the output is the phase margin. For this, we have employed an algorithm that searches the worst case. It is not very aggressive in order to ensure coverage for all regions, and the obtained results are depicted here under the form of a scatter matrix plot, which represents a matrix of scatter plots such that the variables can be visualized 2 by 2. On horizontal, all 5 columns are the operating conditions which were varying during the experiment. We have the load current, the input voltage, the external capacitor, its parasitic resistance, and the temperature. On the vertical, we have the very same variables in order to obtain scatter plots 2 by 2. Since the configuration is as described, it means that the matrix is symmetrical. This image is the same with this one but transposed. Therefore, it makes sense only to look either above the diagonal or below it. The phase margin is coded by color as it is estimated on the waveform. Red values means low phase margin values, which are bad for stability, while blue values mean high phase margin values. Here the circuit is stable. The limit is set around 30 degrees, which means that whatever is depicted below the yellow line, the circuit is considered to be unstable. As expected, the most influential parameters for the circuit depicted in the previous slides are the load current and the parasitic resistance. These parameters are the dominant ones, and it can be observed how the yellow and red points are concentrated for low values of the parasitic resistance of the capacitor. It is important to be observed and consider that the sampling is not uniform. The simulations are focused on the region where the transition takes place, where the low values of the phase margin are. This allows us to benefit of a better resolution in the region of interest and lower resolution in the region where the circuit is stable and fine, where we have several blue points. This can be observed also by inspecting the histogram of the diagonal for each parameter. From the load current histogram, you can observe how the simulations are distributed. Most of them were run for low values of IQ. The same for the parasitic resistance. These histograms are also a measure of sensitivity. For example, the capacitor plays a role not as big as the load current and the parasitic resistance, but it is still important since the algorithm insisted on sampling the high values of CQ, while the values for the input voltage and for the temperature play little or no role for our analysis. To conclude, the metamodel fine mean controller employed for the pre-silicon phase margin characterization was able to offer improved resolution in the region of interest, thus leading to redundancy reduction, and also provide a better characterization for multiple factor variations, thus offering a better understanding of the circuit functioning. Overall, our solution needed a reduced simulation budget, 1000 simulations, compared to planned experiments approach. That would require a total number of 100,000 simulations for a full grid sampling. Moreover, the number of simulations is fixed, regardless of the number of factors. The explanation for this approach is based on the principle that only few parameters are actually dominating this. The rest are only contributing with lower weights, smaller percentages. It means that most of the space is redundant, and when performing full grid, most of the simulation will tell us nothing. While with adaptive verification, we focus exactly on the region where we are close to the worst case. The methodology is generally applicable for any worst-case analysis for a broad spectrum of products and problems. The presented solutions developed during iDev 4.0 project targeted several product lines within Infineon. Based on their feedback, we were able to draw several conclusions. Firstly, our findings significantly minimizes the effort required for IC verification, while improving the verification coverage. Considering that the verification process takes 40 to 60% of the total IC development costs, our methods improve the cost-performance trade-off. Moreover, since the percentage is valid for only one IC product, and Infineon develops hundreds of products per year, the market potential is significantly important. The main benefits for users are related to reducing time, further translated into verification cost reduction, and fast time to market. Our methodologies are versatile as they are generally applicable for the presented use case for a broad spectrum of products. Moreover, the developed adaptive verification methodologies were successfully adopted by Infineon departments from ATV divisions in Bucharest and Padua. Thank you.